Alrighty. Kind of had some free time here. I'm working at a customer site and I got a little downtime. So I wanted to do a quick presentation of a project that I've been working on called postReceive. You guys should be able to see the mouse pointing here. Perfect. So this is the documentation page, treestarsystems.atlassian.net/wiki. Here is the documentation page that I have for the other projects as well, such as there's postReceive, and then there's the other, which is the Growbox project, which I'll be picking up work on again after this postReceive project. Took a little bit of break from that one and did some other things, and then got kind of this kind of fell in my lap in terms of a customer wanted something done, or they mentioned something, and then I was like, well, yeah, that sounds like an interesting project. I know that can be done. And I just took it upon myself to do it. They're not paying me for it or anything else like that. But hopefully it's something that I can that I've already presented to them, and hopefully they can bring me onto their project just in case they need any help with it. So with postReceive, essentially what it is, it's an email to API transport system. So the best way to explain it is the visual that I've made for this, which is located, of course, on the documentation page here. So mail flow pretty much is a message comes in via any email service, or I do have a couple test scripts so I can actually simulate emails with attachments. But for instance, if I was to send an email out via send an email out via Office 365, Google, or whatever other mail service to my test server, then it's going to come in. And let's actually blow this up here. So it's going to come in as an incoming message. And usually with DNS, you have multiple MX records or mail exchange records. So essentially, you would have a postfix server. And postfix, the way it works, postfix, it just accepts and it sends and receives email messages. So in this case, what it'll do is when it actually receives something, it's actually made to kick off a script, that Node.js script in this case, that will actually take that email and then forward it on, or take that email, parse it, and then go from there. So that script that's called under the project directory under server processor.js, that script is called processor.js, and then what it does, it actually takes that email message from standard input, which is pretty much just a console, and writes it to a .eml file. So that file there can be opened up later on. It is a valid EML file syntax. So then it writes all that to a .eml file under the messages _ storage messages folder. So what it does, what you can do is actually that messages storage folder can actually be mounted to another data storage point. So Ceph cluster, what have you, whatever your underlying file system or underlying file system or what have you is mounted at that point, especially when you're using Linux. I'm not making this for Windows, so use Linux if you are going to get into this, if you want to try this out. So once it does that, it stores the email. Then it also takes information from that email, it actually writes information to a JSON object called PR message. And that JSON object is taken. So for instance, in PR object, let's go over to postReceive here. This is the actual code here. So let's look at it, processor.js. And then in processor.js, let me just make sure we're still good here. Yeah, perfect. Let's increase the size of that. So in processor.js, you have this PR message JSON object, and that JSON object takes the current date timestamp, and that date timestamp is it's in milliseconds or epoch time, or milliseconds since epoch. Then the PR message, it generates a alphanumeric character string that is 20 characters long. And that's brought in by another function that I have in one of the required files up here, which is under PR modules. PR modules folder, PR modules.js. So then you have PR message.file name. So this is the actual file name that we're going to be putting together here. And this is how we're going to name our EML file. So it'll be message dash and then PR message.timestamp. So it'll actually be the timestamp here for this JSON object, which is defined earlier. And then dash and then PR message.id, and then the ID is that 20 character alphanumeric string, and then .eml. So that's your whole EML file. I can also take that later and then do whatever I need to with it. Then all of that, it actually has an object for the actual full file path, because just in case anything happens, I want, if it's flushed to disk, another feature I'll be adding later is picking up where it left off. So for instance, if anything happens, server shuts down for any reason, or the queue size gets too big, it's a lot easier to write these things to the file system and then pull them into memory one by one, as opposed to them having, for instance, for file systems or for systems that will have a high load on them. Then it's like, okay, well, I can take this information in, I can save it, and then I can always go back to it later on. And then it could just be put in a queue from there. And that's just a little bit of premature optimization, because a lot of this stuff I can actually write into a buffer of some sort and then have everything stored in memory. So this is, I kind of made it for systems that aren't heavy in terms of they aren't heavy in terms of their RAM specs. So that's my thought on that. That of course can be changed later on. And then from there, you have this PR message. So then after that, it'll submit the message. But first, let's go down. So this is the function to actually submit that message. A part of the things that I have to do is change the permission. So I wanted to make sure that was done. And that's another function that I bring in. So I have Node.js actually do that. And it does it asynchronously. I have it doing asynchronously. So there isn't any blockage to the event loop itself. So these variables here are defined earlier on. So you can actually easily change those. So you don't have to go through all the code, which isn't much at all, really. I think like 100 lines here. No, 64 lines. 64 lines of code, but you can actually put these in yourself, or actually have these mapped from other variables or a database or something like that, however you wish. But essentially, it's the protocol, which is HTTP, server, localhost, server port, and then the actual endpoint, which is defined in the server folder / index.js file. So right here, it's going to actually take that information, PR message, and then it's going to use Axios to do a API call here, and it's going to be doing an API post call, and then essentially it's going to push all that information over to the endpoint, and then respond back with whatever the endpoint gives us. So, like a 500 or server not found 404 or anything like that, or a 200 message. Sorry, a 400 message, 500 message, 200 message being okay in this case. Right now, I only have it programmed for a 200 message. So everything should just quote unquote work, right? So this is the function that kind of does all the magic here. So read std and in. So that's read standard input. And I'm using the read line function or method from the Node.js standard library, or the Node.js it's included within Node.js, so I forgot the way to say that. But essentially, input and then process.standard input. And that's really it to get us started here, create interface and then get us started. I don't have it outputting anything to standard output, but it can be, I left it in there so it can actually be re-enabled there, so that if there's anything that we need to do in terms of debugging or anything like that, we can. So after this, what I do is I start a write stream, and this is an asynchronous write stream. And that write stream is going to take the object or the full path from the PR message object, JSON object, and it's going to take in line, and then it takes in like the line character here. So each one of these things is known as a line, and then it's mapped to this right here, this variable, and then this is using an arrow function, so it doesn't really have a name or anything like that, but it is a function nonetheless. and then everything for line gets written to a file. With the way this works, I actually add in all the lines again. So the end of line characters. And what that does, it keeps my formatting. I haven't tried it without it. I believe it would probably cause some issues, but I'm not exactly sure. I was going through a lot when I was trying to get this right. So it was kind of one of those things where I didn't get into, okay, now that I have it working, let me break it to see if this works. So that'll be something that I have to look at again. So encoding mode, UTF-8 mode, and this is how you do write modes actually, or permission modes. So this actually in Linux, you would have this as say 0770, or in some cases 770, or 0x770. So in this case, with the way Node.js actually does modes or permissions, you actually have to do 0 lowercase o 770 in this case. So that's just going to make it read writable and executable for the user and the group, but nothing and no one else. And I did that for permission, for security's sake. So everything should be read and written as the www user, and you want to do this whole process or run this whole process as the www-data user. That's how I have everything set up, even in the postfix config, which you can actually look at, and then how to make that that actual little change there, which I'll work to automate that. And then again, another arrow function. So anything for the error, for error itself, just gets thrown as an error, and then that gets thrown out, and you see that. But in terms of success, I don't do anything like console log or anything like that here. What I do is dot on, and it took me a while to get this actually right. So dot on, and when it shows the, it actually throws a close signal on for the file itself, the write stream, which is this dot on here, which I actually have to wait. I'm just trying to make sure if my closures are correct. Oh, okay. No, it's actually for this read line. So once this read line, when it says like, when it receives a line, then it writes to the write stream. Then when it receives a close signal or throws a close signal, because there's also, I believe, a dot on, and then you could do finish, and especially for write stream, you have that option. But once it throws close, and this is in the Node.js documentation, arrow function takes in no parameters, which is why these parentheses are just opened and closed and blank. And then what I have it do is change the permissions just to make sure that's set properly. And then once those permissions are set properly, then it's going to execute, or not once, but it'll set those permissions, but then it actually transports everything via Axios over to the actual API. And this is kind of where some of the magic happens, or the real work happens, is right in here. It's probably one of the more important portions of it, because what it does is it actually takes that email message, takes a JSON object, so then I can transfer that JSON object over to my messages API endpoint. And then messages API endpoint, once it receives it, it says, oh, okay, so this is the message, this is the object that I have to look out for, or this is the object with the information for that object, or for this new email that has come in. And then now I can parse things like the full file path and the time and things like that. So once that's done, then if there's an error, it logs error. If it's a response of or the actual JSON, the actual response of the endpoint, because the endpoint is in Express, and with Express, it'll answer, and it'll actually send an actual response, and we'll see that. So this is just a quick overview, and then of course finally I actually execute the code here at the bottom. So by executing the code, it will go ahead and do all these things here. In fact, I just noticed submit message. Oh. So it doesn't use this function here. So I guess got to take that out. There's still some cleanup I have to do. But essentially all this stuff I have to take out, or I'm just going to substitute with this submit message function here. We'll go from there. So now if I go back to diagram, that's actually just the processor. So the processor is going to take the email in from standard input and then write it to an EML file and then transport that JSON object via Axios to the messages endpoint. The messages endpoint will be the URL, in this case, API /API/message. And at that URL or that endpoint, I'm going to allow for later on, as I increase functionality, for you to download the message, do a name search for that message, text search for that message, and then do a ID search for that message. So using that 20-character ID, you can actually go ahead and search for that message, and it'll bring up all the information for that message itself, so that you can get its attachments or anything else like that. But again, that's something that I'll make available, but I don't think I'm going to totally build out unless somebody wants some type of further configuration or anything like that, or integration is a better word. So let's go over to the server folder, routes API message.js file. If there's anybody in the chat, sorry, I'm not looking at the chat. Usually with these, I just focus on doing the presentation. So let's go server. But hey to anybody that is in the chat, and of course, hey to all the people that listen to the playback, or anybody that's interested in the project itself. So let's go to routes API and message.js. And so from here, I haven't done the .get, so the /get, there's nothing that happens there. But here, later on, I want to be able to add a single message. So this will be taking all that information in and actually adding it to a database, which I have not connected this to. But again, sky's the limit to that. Any database that you want, that you can find a library or a wrapper or anything, or any type of connectivity method to, if you want to do SQLize, if you want to use the MongoDB connector, Mongoose DB connector, or the Mongoose MongoDB connector, Postgres DB connector, what have you, which I believe is in SQLize as well. I haven't really used that project, but I've heard of it in other tutorials. Ouch. Sorry, had to crack my neck there. So we have a function which will be called in later, which is just convert attachment. So essentially, this is just going to actually extract attachment and convert it to its own separate file. So if anything, I'll probably rename that to extract attachment in later releases. And I'll go over that as it comes in. So function, process message, and then PR object. So it's going to take in that PR object. This is the parameter, actually. But it's going to take in that PR object that is passed here. So this is kind of where the actual endpoint does its work. So if anything is posted to it, I'm going to use the body parser.json middleware. And that's going to help me actually parse the JSON object and get the information out of it. So I'm going to do post / and then, or just /. So that is anything that comes to the API. So the URL /API /message endpoint, it's going to handle this when it gets a post request to that endpoint. If it receives a get request, it'll trigger this here. Let me make sure here. Yeah, we're still good there. Alrighty. So now, once it gets that request, I'll back up here. Once it gets that request, process message, which is this function down here, and then it's going to get the request.body. So it's going to be an asynchronous function here. So we can do async await if we need to. And I can await some of this information here. So I can do like a await process message and then go from there. It's going to take the request and then the result. So the request is the request that's pushed into it, the post request. And then the result is the actual status that I'm going to pass. So res.status. And then I'm going to say, hey, the status is 200, meaning it's all good. and you have to look up your HTML statuses if you don't know anything about those. So if you get like a 404 or 504 bad gateway or anything like that, those are HTML actual requests and statuses. And then I'm going to send done, and we'll see how that plays into it later. So if we go down to the actual message here, this is where NodeMailer's simple parser comes in play. And simple parser, what it does, it takes an EML file or an email message, and once read, it'll read it into simple parser, and then you can parse it and take all the little pieces out of it. So from here, PR process message, and that's just this is something I'm going to be referencing later on, but this is where all of our information is going to be loaded into as we parse it from that .eml file that we wrote earlier. So if error, throw error, that'll be the first one. So let parsed equal await simple parser parentheses data. So in this case, that's the data that's coming in, which is defined here, right? So fs.read file. So I'm going to read that EML file, and using that document or that object that came in, which is the PR object.PR full path. Again, sometimes it's a little bit like confusing. You know, you try to name things so at different points. It surely did confuse me when I first started. So it's like you just kind of have to keep track of some of these things in your head. But you have your process message, and then your request.body. So that's what's coming in. And your process message is the function, and the request.body is what you're actually passing in. That gets mapped to PR object. So it's known as that within this function. So you can pass in whatever you want. That could actually be request fully spelled out, or REQ, or RES. Well, it won't be RES. But in this case, REQ.body, and I believe that's a bit hard-coded in there. It's either going to be request spelled out or REQ, and that's how Express works, or that's getting into how Express works. Most of the examples that I saw always say REQ, and then your request, and then your response, and those are the shorthands for those two. In this case, that is known as PR object. So file read.PR object, and that's the JSON object that we received earlier. So that JSON object has the full path of the EML file. So I'd like to use the full exact path in this case, just in case somebody installs it in a directory that you know, it's important to them, or of some value or some consequence to them. In my test box, you'll see it's installed in /opt/project name, which is postReceive. So I try to make it a little bit more flexible in that case, especially with people that have infrastructures where they can't put things in the opt folder or have a problem with that, personal problem, even if, you know, that's not what they like. Some of these things are commented out, so I'll just skip over those. So simple parser, if we go to the top here, we have simple parser, and then it's required from the mail parser project, and then of course .simple parser. And I've used mail parser, and I know about it because I use it to actually send emails from my other Node.js project, which is kind of how I got into this. And it was just like, yo, this kind of stars aligned. That simple parser allows you to do all these things. So it's kind of really the it's a bit of the backbone here in terms of or it's part of the foundation backbone, if you will, of this whole entire project. So it makes things a lot easier. So if parsed.headers.has, so, and again, we mapped parsed to this actual function here, and then put our data into it, which is remapped or shown from here. All right, or defined here, and that's the that's what is coming in. So it's going to read that file, and then it's going to map that to this parameter here, and then from that parameter, we're going to pass that parameter to simple parser, and then that's going to be mapped to the variable parsed, and then now we can start calling things from that actual from that EML file, but parsed by simple parser. So with parse.headers, in simple parser, you're going to have to actually look at its documentation, and within its documentation, it tells you how to get all these different objects. and how to do that. In this case, the headers file or the headers variable is a map, I should say, or the headers object is a map object. And to look if something is within a mapped object, or to view a map object, or to get anything out of a mapped object, there's different ways you're going to have to do that. So if I look up, say, for instance, map dot get map dot, I think it has, there we go, prototype has, there we go. So map.prototype has, and essentially here's a good definition, better than I can actually say. The has method returns a Boolean indicating whether an element with a specified key exists or not. So this is pretty much like an if statement, or it's the value you get from an if statement to see if something is true or false. So if parsed headers dot has, headers is the mapped object, and then has, does it have something that says subject in it? And of course, this is lowercase here. And then if it does have it, then put in this. So I can actually take that and say, hey, listen, if it's not there, then I need to put undefined or something like that. There's a lot more that needs to be done to this. So that just in case I have an email that has no subject, and making sure that I account for that and then put something in its place. Like for instance, like a undefined or NA or not available or something else or blank, whatever you wish, especially when I put it into the database so we don't really get any errors. Because you always, when you make your tests, your first test for your initial release, you just want to make sure you get everything working. Then after that point, you do things like, oh, okay, well, now that it's working, let me start throwing some wrenches into this whole thing and see if it still works. So I do the same thing and I repeat for the from and then the to. But what you'll notice from the documentation of Simple Parser, the headers, this value here is actually an array. So with that, I have to get the dot value from this, what's it called? The header, from this header object, or it's from the sub object of the header object. So that's an array because, for instance, for addresses, it's always an array. It should only be from one person, but for the to CC, BCC, which you will not see on a message, but for the to and CC, you're going to have sometimes multiple addresses, like, the people that it's meant for, but then the other people that are carbon copied for any reason. So this right here, I get the actual date. So this object is just a JSON object from this point. So it's parsed.date, and then I can actually get the date. And what I did with this is prmessage.timestamps. So I like my timestamps, or I like times in different formats. And it's really good for instance, if I have to run things like, so I don't have to do conversions later, I try to do it at the beginning when the data is inputted into the database, or input it into the flow of what I'm doing. So parse.date, this actually gives me an ISO date or ISO format date, which we'll see here in a little bit once I actually run the test or run the demonstration. The date human, so that'll give me my UTC or my the date for my time zone, and it'll tell me what time zone I am in and how what's the offset for GMT. Which would be like -4 for my area because I live in South Florida. And then the actual date itself in milliseconds. So that's my date dash epoch. So that'll so I can actually take that and say, and do things like, actually run, it's a full integer, or it's an integer. So I can actually run calculations against that. So I can say the date now versus the date from the timestamp, and then I can see how many days ago that was, and then convert that to something that's human readable. That's just something that I know I'm going to need later on for whatever reason. For instance, how long it took before somebody picked up this email or whatever, depending on the system. But I want to give myself and anybody else who uses this an option to do that. And then of course there's a lot more you can add to it. So parse the message ID, and that's the message ID within the email itself. Headers in reply to, again, this is another map object, and this map object contains addresses. And actually, I have to look into this a little bit more because I believe the in reply to should be an array as well. So I have to make sure that's getting mapped to the dot value. So I'll look into that later. And then reply to, which is an address object, and then references. So for instance, I believe this references portion is if you have a message that references another message, if it's in a chain of messages. So then that's how like email service providers will read that message and say, oh, okay, this is in reference to this message. And then you see that whole chain of your conversation. This is where we start getting into the body of the email itself. So the HTML version of the body, and I do have to add some logic in there. For instance, if the HTML portion is blank, what do I do? The same thing with the text. If it's blank, what do I do? Some of these things are actually, they will just show as undefined, which might be fine. But how do I handle that? How do I write that to the database? Do I want to write that to the database at all? Some of these things that you want to see, done. Then this is where we get into the attachment. So PR attachment count, that's just a variable to keep track of how many attachments that I have, and not keep track of how many attachments that I have, but how I can actually name those attachments and name it as a sub object, sub JSON object. And you'll see how I deal with that. So parsed dot attachments. So attachments is a object, is a JSON object. And then for each one of the attachments, or each sub item of that JSON object attachments, then I can actually start parsing and getting information such as the name of the attachment. And in this case, I want to take the file name and then dot replace any spaces with underscores, and then convert the entire file name to lowercase. And I do that to make it easier in terms of storing on a file system. That may be a problem. For instance, for people that want a file name actually has some information where case sensitivity is important, so that can always be taken out later. All you have to do is just delete this to lower portion of it here. Attachment path. So this is where we get the full path of the actual the file itself and where it's going to be stored. So core.core vars, and again the core, my little core library or modules, I should say, are all up here. So that is defined here by core, and this is just to this modules file. And I export a variable out of that modules file that has the message directory, attachments directory, and some other things. So right here, what I'm going to do is, I believe this is called like the variable substitution method. So you're using, this is not a single quote, this is a backtick, but core.core vars attachment stored. So this is where I'm storing the actual attachments. And then of course you can mount that to anywhere. You can mount that to larger storage or anything like that. The messages store is temporary. But what happens is anything in that messages folder gets deleted, because at that point it's already a JSON object, or it's already parsed into a JSON object and then should be shipped to the database. But just in case it's not, then that file may not be deleted. The reason I state that is, for instance, you might have a small system with a small hard drive or a small bit of space on that drive, and if everything goes well, you don't have to worry about that drive filling up for any reason, because it'll just get read. It'll get after it's read and parsed, then it gets deleted. So from here, we name our attachment message, and then the same timestamp as that we receive in our PR object, and then the same ID as well, and then the same attachment name. So you're all done? All right, give me a moment, guys. Wait a second. Just gonna mute up for a moment. Alrighty, guys. As I said, I was here at a customer site, so I apologize for the brief interruption there. Uh, but just had to finish up things here for that, and then we'll just go through this. Essentially, this is only the messages that we'll go through, so there's not much more before we actually start to do the test. From here, the attachments, and then we make a sub object, and then we just do some string concatenation or variable concatenation, or variable string concatenation. And now what we're making is attachment and then 0. So it starts at 0 and then increments from there. And then it increments this PR attachment count variable. And from there, and then it gets done outside here, outside of the loop. So now I'm getting the processing status code. So that's where I'm going to start adding in certain things. Oh, let's go back to this. Project timestamp, project PRID, or PR object, I should say, .PRID, which is a 20-character alphanumeric string, dash, and then the actual attachment name that comes with it after it's been edited here, or we've done some changes with string replacements and things like that, or we've done some character substitutions. Now, if we go to processing status code, so right now it'll be at 0, so it hasn't been processed. But later on, what I want to do is increment it to where we like push that up to something. For instance, if it can actually do that later on, once we actually push things out to the database, then we can say, hey, listen, this has been processed, and then go from there. And I might actually add a status code to the general message here as well, so that we can keep track of that. And then what I would do is have, say, 0 is this, 1 is this, 2 is this, and go from there. Let me make sure everything's good. Yeah, I am. All right, good. I'm going to follow this on the phone as well. Yeah. Okay, great. So there's one person watching, which is cool. So it's actually. Oh, Dollar Will, thank you for joining. I just saw this, so thanks for coming in. So let me just mute that. Okay. Alrighty, so with this, just to continue on, file name, so attachment name, and that's the variable that I made up here. And then the content type, and that's taken from the actual JSON object that's parsed through Simple Parser. Content disposition, checksum size, encoding, content, content ID, CID related, all those things are available via Simple Parser and taken from the Simple Parser variable itself. What I do, one of the few things I change or deal with is taking that attachment.file name and turning it into, like, doing all my my text transformations. Then encoding. There's also a subheader within the, there's a headers map within the attachment. And all I get from that is content transfer encoding, because a lot of these other things, such as the content ID and CID and other things like that, or the content ID, which is different from the CID, because I believe one just doesn't have the greater than, less than signs on either side of the string itself. But the biggest one here is the attachment path. So content for attachment path. Now, once I actually do this attachment, I need the attachment path, because this is where I actually start to read the file and I extract the attachment. And I do that here under convert attachment. So the naming convention was I'm converting this attachment from the base64 encoding to the actual file that it's going to be stored as. So whether it be a PDF file, what have you. But I will rename that to extract attachment later. So what it takes in is attachment.content. And again, we're still within this for each loop. So for each one of these JSON objects, or for each one of these attachment JSON objects, I'm actually running all of this code and then incrementing, and then until I've gone through all of them. So attachment.content, so that's the actual content within the attachment itself, and that is a buffer object, and in that from that buffer object, it reads out to the actual it reads out via fs read, which I'll show you here in the actual function, and then the path. And I take this path as a parameter because I want to store it somewhere. Or this is where I want to actually store it. So this is the attachment path, which is defined here. Right. So this is what's parsed from simple parser, and this is something that I made myself, of course, using my string substitutions and everything like that, or string transformations. So let's go up to that function, which is above here. Wait, is it above? Yeah, it is. There we go. Okay. So convert attachment. So here it takes in content and then in path, and that's the parameters that it takes in. This uses a write stream, and write streams, from my research, are good for large file formats. So for instance, if I have a large PDF or a large image or even a large like a movie file or something like that that's sent via email, which is usually not the case anymore. But if I have anything that's a large attachment, I've also made changes to postfix itself to where it actually takes in larger attachments, and that's under the, come out of here, that's under install. And then you see the postfix changes that we make here. So under here, this is where you actually see the postfix changes, where we change the size limit to something just really huge. I think that's about like a meg or a gig or something like that, but hopefully it should be able to do all that. So I haven't been able to test anything that big. So let's go back over to the function. This one's pretty simple in comparison to some of the others, but it's going to take a write stream, or it's going to use a write stream, and that write stream is it's the path here, or taking the path parameter. So that takes the full path of the actual email itself. Oh no, this is where it's going to be written out to. Sorry, this is where it's going to be written out to, and then the write stream dot write it's going to write out the content that's passed here as a parameter with this flag, which is the write flag. And in Node.js, if you look up, oh man, I believe it's Node.js. Sorry, it's bothering me, so I want to make sure that Node.js. Yes, under Node.js file system. And from here, you can see in the documentation, create write stream. And then under create write stream, this is these are all the things that you can do within it. So the different options and flags and things like that. So support file system flags, and then it tells you the different file system flags. So A for append, AX, A+, things like that. And you can find that in the Node.js file system documentation, or Node.js documentation under the file system section. So this is an asynchronous function and takes a callback. So in this case, the callback is an arrow function, and it just says error this. If it's an error, throw the error. But at the end of it all, write everything. Now, the difference between this write stream function and the last write stream function is that this data is not really coming in as chunks. It's coming in from the file system itself. So it's pushing all this data out as quick as, or it's pushing all this data out and being read, not as chunks, which usually you're going to get file byte chunks, or you're going to get data chunks when you're transferring over a network. So for instance, if you're concatenating a file using netcat or something like that over a network to a Node.js process, you're going to get this data in chunks. So I had to deal with a couple different things. So for instance, in the last write stream function that was used to actually write the email, I was having so many issues trying to get this right. but I was able to find information, and I usually publish all my bookmarks for all my research at the end of a project. So I actually have to put that out right now, and then I'll update it as we go along. But you'll see all the documentation or all the bookmarks that I use. I have no problem with showing my sources for my code. But at the end of the write stream in the processor.js, what you have to do is dot on, and then parentheses, and then in single quotes, you have to do close. So once the file is closed, then execute this. But in this case, I can do a write stream and then write stream end afterward. And that's because the data doesn't come in chunks. And that's how I understand it. If anybody has, if you've made it this far in the video and anybody has any other information, let me know so that you can better explain it to me. But on write stream write stream dot on finish. So as I said previously, it was dot on close, and it was actually written differently as well because it was still a part of, say, this function when you were doing read line. But on finish takes in no parameters for this arrow function, and then it changes the permissions and then using the path. And I do that because I want to make sure, in security wise, that we're closing up any security holes that we might have once that file is written. Making sure that only the right people can actually access this file and do what it needs to. So it has a secure transmission or secure storage, really, while it's on the system. And that's pretty much it for the convert attachment, which will be named extract attachment later. And then from there, once all that's done, it increments the count and then moves on to the other attachment, if any. Then this is where this is just for testing, console log PR processed message. And that's going to output all the information that we're going to see here in a moment. Then I call in the file system library and then do a dot unlink. So that's for deletion. So I'm going to actually delete the PR object dot PR full file path. And I might change it to email file path or EML file path. And the reason why we're deleting that is because we don't need it anymore. At this point, if everything goes well, I should have shipped it off to the database, this JSON object. I should have shipped that JSON object off to the database. And then once that's done, then I'll call the fs unlink to actually delete that file because it's no longer needed. And then if I need to transport the attachment itself as well to another storage point, then I would also do that here and then delete that attachment as well. Or run further processing on that attachment, such as any OCR or document parsing. And I'm actually looking into that as a planned feature to start looking through your popular documents, your PDFs, your DocX, XLSX, and PPTX. So, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and even some of the open document formats as well. So I'm going to be getting to that. And then, of course, it just says at the end, file deleted, and we'll look through that. And then, of course, it actually exports this as a router, and that's just for Express itself, or the Express router in this case. And if you know about Node.js and Express, that's how we're getting the / endpoints and things like that. So let's go to server. Let's see what else. I'm not going to go over the attachment.js. There's nothing in there yet. That remains to be seen in terms of like what I'm going to add to it. Let's go over to the diagram. My mouth is getting dry right now. Been talking so much. So let's look over this diagram. So the email messages come in. Then we've send it to the processor.js. The postfix daemon delivers it to the processor.js. Takes the standard input, converts that to a .eml file, or writes it to a file that has a .eml extension or ends in a .eml. Writes it with the message dash the date in milliseconds dash 20 character string .eml. Then, while it's written that, it's going to transport the information about that object, such as the file path and timestamp and other information that we find important that's needed, and transport it via Axios to our API endpoint, whatever that may live on another server, local host, what have you. Then from there, it's going to start doing our processing in there. It's going to start processing that message itself, and then also extracting. It's going to read this message file here, and then extract the attachment and store it wherever you like. And that information can actually be, and I'll show you where you can actually change the attachment storage and the attachment storage and the message storage folders. And you can also actually change it to where you never really get rid of these messages, but that can take a lot of data in a short period of time, depending on the flow of your data or the amount of email flow you have. So this is a two-way arrow here. So it actually reads this and then also reads this into this message.js, and then of course goes back and deletes it later on. There will be some functions that are exported from this attachment.js where I can do some processing, but some processing might actually happen in here, or I might just have everything shipped so I can actually process later on, because if you're going to start processing Word and Excel, that might take quite some time to do. All right, so that's done there. But that I'll have to go over later on. But this is pretty much the initial portion of it and how it all works. So I've explained all that. Let me show it to you. And I'm just going to switch the application that's viewed here. Hey, this is me. All right, application window, and boom, I am gone, or will be gone. There we go. Alrighty, so just want to make sure this shows up here. Perfect, it does. All right, great. So in the top, I use Termius for all my client as my SSH client. I like it. It works great. It works on my phone and other devices, and then I can get to all my different servers and customer servers as well. And I love Termius for that. So with Termius, I'm able to just log into a server, and I don't really use Atom. I try to, and then I don't use Visual Studio Code or anything like that. I just use Termius and then the screen binary. And with screen, you can split your screen into different sections like I have here. So I make sure you can see my mouse here as I'm tracking it around. I'm watching on my phone, by the way, just so I can, perfect. All right, great. All right. So at the top here, we actually have the process ran using NodeMon, and NodeMon is great because if I save a file or anything like that underneath the project, it will actually restart all services, which is awesome. Then below that, this is where I'm actually going to run my executable or run my actual testing in this window to the bottom left. To the right and the right top split here, this is the log for the actual postfix mail server. Below that, we're actually looking at all the we're looking at the contents of the folder of the messages folder, and then below that, bottom right hand corner, we're looking at the attachments folder. So now I'm gonna move my cursor over to this here, and now I'm gonna cd to and postReceive. So this is the content here, and of course this is all on GitHub. Repository documentation and any other links are all stored into the Peace Anti-Gravity. Appreciate you showing up for this here. Even if for a little bit, appreciate anybody that shows up to see all this, some of the things that I've been working on. Also, definitely check out the Black Brain Trust. I think they have shows damn near every day of the week now, in terms of some of the things that are available, some of the things that are interesting, in terms of like geopolitics, finance, black technology, so on and so forth. So definitely check out the Black Brain Trust. And uh, Dollar Will talks a lot on finance and trading, and Anti-Gravity talks about geopolitics. He's pretty much jack of all trades and business as well. So here, we're going to do a run. So what I'm going to do first is just do a simple test using Telnet. And I've already made a script for that. So you can use these scripts as well. I include them in the project. There's a couple message scripts that I do not include in the project because of some of the information that it contains in terms of PDFs and things like that. I probably will make some dummy ones later on with larger PDFs that might actually have some more data in it, so I can do a little bit more in terms of stress testing of this project. But first, we're going to just do a test email via Telnet. So all this is going to do is connect to the local host. And then when it connects to the local host, then it's going to start running all the commands that an email server would run. But, excuse me, due to the input, it runs a little bit on the slower side. So it actually sleeps every second between every command, just to make sure that all commands go through and that it answers. It's just kind of the way postfix works. Well, how it works with my script, I could probably make it faster because I see that mail flow happens a lot faster with Gmail or Microsoft using Office 365. So first, we're going to see I'll run this script. You'll see some action happen here. Action happen here in the bottom split. The right-handed side, bottom split. The top split. And then really quick, you'll see something in messages, which is right below it. And then finally, you might see something in attachments, but not on this one. On this one, you won't see anything on attachments. On the next one, you'll see something on attachments. So that might, but definitely not. In the top is where we're going to get our JSON object that spits out. And that JSON object later on will be transported to our MongoDB, SQL-based database, what have you. So let's go ahead and run this. Takes a second. Doing each command. You see in a connection. Processes. Maybe see a message here. Nope, happened so fast that it doesn't create a message. But as you can see, it's been removed from the queue, and it's been delivered to our actual script. And one thing, I should show it here. Here we go. So delivered via postReceive service and then done. So that done comes from our message.js. In our message.js, it responds with a response of HTML response code of 200, and then it also sends the word done. So that's pretty cool. You can actually have it send other things if you want, and then that response, depending on the response that's given, you can actually key off of that and do other things. So okay, if it responds with done, then mark complete, move on to the next. Or if it responds with unknown or bad, then have some other trigger something else. Okay, running low on battery there. It's just my phone. Okay, so let's explain this JSON object. So this goes into the attachment.js. This is what's producing this information and logging it to console, and then finally saying file deleted. As you can see, this is a larger JSON object, or it's an overall JSON object. And within that JSON object, it has the key value pair, so key and then the value. So subject and then test from the address, which is the address I put in here, and then my name, which is nothing right now. I can actually add that in later on, or I can add that in once I put in once I fill in that actual script, and then my timestamp. So these are the timestamps I was talking about earlier. This is your ISO-based timestamp. This is your human readable timestamp, and then this is your timestamp in milliseconds. And with the timestamp in milliseconds, I can start doing different operations against that. such as subtracting, deleting, finding out differences in between different timestamps, so I can convert something to milliseconds, do the do like a subtraction, like greater than, less than, or plus this, what have you, to deal with any offsets or anything else like that, or just to see how long from when this JSON object was created to it got delivered or anything else like that. So I can kind of track things a little bit. So then we also have message ID here. So under message ID, message ID is taken from the actual email itself. Then HTML, in this case, it says false. Text, though, the text section of the email actually has some data. So it's like, this is interesting. So it says false. Okay, well, if it says false or undefined or anything like that, I need to know what to do with that. And that's kind of the logic that I have to add in later on, just to make sure, this thing actually works. And then text, this is a test message, and then new line character. Text as HTML, so this is a test message, and then it actually converts that to HTML. Not converts it, but it actually presents it as HTML. Attachments, there are no attachments on this, so I have nothing in that JSON object for attachments. So that would be 0. So all that information can now be shipped over to MongoDB. And that's kind of like the point of all this, an email to API transport project. And that's pretty much like what it does. Like all of that explanation, culminates into a JSON object like this, and then I can ship it to wherever I need to. So now let's try with something a little bit bigger. So if I do cat test and then message, I have 3 messages in here. I will upload a larger EML file or a larger test with another PDF. So the one that I had, I can actually have it to where it's like it has different documents and things like that in it, different images and things like that. In fact, I think if I do ls test. Message 3. Yeah, it doesn't really have much in there. Okay. So in this case, since I know my processor scripts takes things from standard input, and it's a script that could be ran by itself, because I actually, at the top of that script itself, it actually has a shebang, which is the £, exclamation point, / and then it runs in the Node shell itself. So it executes as a Node program itself, and it's a self-executable file, or a self-executing file, as long as you have Node.js and all the proper dependencies. So I can actually run that, and that's what postfix actually runs and kicks off, and then does all this magic here. But I can actually, the point I'm making is that I can cat things into that file, because that would serve as standard input for me in this case. So let's do a test on that. Test message to email, and then server process. Oh. So server processor.js. Excuse me. So from this, I can actually go ahead and pump everything into this file. This will happen pretty quickly. So what I want you to watch is we'll go over everything in the top split here, but in the bottom split on the right-hand side, the 2 lower portions, so the middle right and the bottom right, I want you to see what happens with the files in there. I have this updating for the messages every second, but it may not be fast enough. But for the attachment, we definitely will see an actual attachment. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and run this. So you saw a message for a moment, got deleted, or got parsed. It got written, parsed, then deleted. And then we have the attachment extracted here. So if we go over this, now we can see here, I'm in screen, so I have to press Control A and then open brackets to actually, look at everything on a screen as it scrolls up. So we have our previous email file here, or email with attachment. Then let's look at another one. So this is our subject of uh, our next file, or our next email. And then the from, as you can see, it's an array, and then in that array it has the from, where it was from, and then who it's to. So if I had multiple people, address and name, I'll have all that information in there. Timestamps, as we talked about before, but this is where it kind of gets a little bit on the interesting side. Now we're seeing the HTML version of that attachment, or of that folder, that file, and then it has all the information within it. And this is another JSON object that we're going to push out to the database. In terms of that same message as text, that message does have a text portion of it. So with it, now it's like, all right, cool. Now I have the text version of that. So it's test, because I wrote that as a portion, a sentence here, and then my signature, and then text as HTML. So that actual text object, instead of just full HTML, it has like text as HTML, kind of simplified there. And then the HTML object itself has a little bit more. So you're seeing things like CSS code and stuff like that, and it's represented there. That's pretty self-explanatory. I'm not going to lie. I wasn't too enthusiastic when I went over that portion. But this is where it kind of gets interesting. This is kind of like the really cool stuff here is the attachments. So this is where we did the string substitution, and this is where you have the PR, attachment count variable, or variable that's set to 0. Then the status code for processing an attachment, and then the file name, so faceservice document.pdf, and then also the content type, attachment, and then the checksum, and then the actual size of it. So you're gonna have to take that size. That's about like a 5.4 megabyte file. So it'll be in bytes, I believe. Yeah, that should be bytes. And then you just have to divide accordingly. Encoding base 64, and then the content, instead of the actual content, this is where the content is stored. And then from here, I can have my content ID, CID related, but that's all undefined. So now I can actually look at all this information, and then it's stored in this folder here, bottom right-hand corner. And this is the file, this is it, the actual extracted PDF file. And this is all the JSON objects with all the email body text. So now I can actually take this PDF file and do other things with it, such as parse it, or do parse it using OCR or any other type of technique. Doing more research on that, trying to find some sample code so that I can actually work with and get started with, or a project that actually does it that has some sample code that I can actually use. So I'm actually still working on that portion. That's why we haven't gone over the attachment.js. But essentially, that's it. That's my project in a nutshell, or for the initial release of it. Pretty much it takes emails, transports it to via, it takes an email to API, and it's just a little transport project that I've been working on recently for the last couple of weeks here. But quite a bit went into that, and I'm pretty happy to show it all off here. But that's pretty much it. So as always, thank you. Check out the repository. Check out the repository link for GitHub. Check out okay, still live. But I'll end the stream here, and internet probably went out over here. But I'll end the stream here, and that's pretty much it for me on that. I hope that last part got in there. I'll be working on this project for another couple weeks before I'll cut off of it and get back to the Growbox project. As always, Thanks for listening. Appreciate you.